Chris Roush from the University of North Carolina. 3 years ago, your predecessor oversaw some subpoenas of business journalists. I'd be interested in knowing what your position is on subpoenas of business journalists.
Diana just told me that. I didn't realize that was coincident with the meeting here. And sounds like it must have been quite an interesting conversation. I guess, look, it's a very hard question, and the SEC has deep respect for the needs of journalists to protect their sources. And we frankly count on journalists to ferret out a lot of the fraud and the misinformation that may exist in the marketplace and to help educate the public and bring to light a lot of issues and a lot of problems. And I'm deeply respectful of that. I understand that my predecessor put into place after that experience a set of procedures and requirements that if the enforcement staff was inclined to try to issue a subpoena, has to go through to get very senior level sign-off in order to do that. And in my short time there, I haven't been confronted with that issue. So I guess that's probably the best answer I can give you, is that there are procedures and processes in place. There is a balance and a test and a tension between the SEC's desire to get to a fraud, to root it out, to stop an ongoing Ponzi scheme, and the need for journalists to be able to protect their sources, and I'm very respectful of that. Thank you.
On this side.
Michelle Leader, footnoted.org. There was a story in today's Wall Street Journal talking about the rules on Twitter and how the SEC is evaluating that, and the communications that different corporations, eBay obviously famously has a blog, there's been talk about that. Where is the SEC on some of these rules, on how that corresponds with Reg FD for companies to communicate going forward?
It's a great question and a really tricky one, as the story in the paper today points out. And again, we are the transparency agency, and the maximum amount of information that can be made available is, to our thinking, a very positive thing. And of course, Reg FD was really about making sure that there wasn't selective disclosure that at the end of the day didn't benefit all investors equally or remotely equally. But those are issues with respect to the new forms of communication that we are studying right now. The staff is actively looking at. I don't have a conclusion for you yet at this point, but I think it's safe to assume that we obviously favor greater and broader disclosure and the utilization. I think the article actually points out the SEC has a Twitter account as well. And so we favor the broadest possible disclosure, but we haven't come to a sort of resolution on each new version of technology that exists.
Bernie Cohn from the Baltimore Sun. Wanted to thank you, first of all, for coming out here. Realize if anyone in the administration who's involved in regulation of the economy right now, it's a little tough to get out of Washington. So really glad that you made the special trip.
Thank you.
Our opening session here yesterday really consisted of a look at ourselves and our own performance, and we titled it 9,000 Financial Journalists Blow It. One of the themes that came up again and again was that the marketplace itself had become so complicated and opaque that the people within it didn't even understand it, let alone the ability of journalists to really dive in and connect the dots. I'm curious how you would look at that, and if so, what do you think would be the SEC's priorities in attempting to make it easier for everybody to connect the dots?
It's such a great question, and I think connecting the dots is actually the essence of it. There was a regulator in Washington who had a handle on each piece, largely, not entirely, but largely on each piece of this complex puzzle that now that we've put together, we understand the severity of the trauma and disruption to the financial system that was being caused. But nobody was really very effectively connecting the dots. Part of that, I think, is a result of the enormous complexity in the markets and the institutions and the products that were being offered. Part of it, I think, in Washington at least, is the very stovepipe nature of regulation, where you can have instruments that are highly correlated and highly interrelated, but with very different regulators having a handle on how those instruments were being used or or the different counterparties to each of the transactions. So I think I think it's just incredibly important for us to have the broader view, to not think of our jurisdiction narrowly in terms of the products that are offered. And this is clearly part of what's driving the administration's view of regulatory reform, is that we get a better, broader, system-wide review of risks in the system. But for the SEC's own purposes, one of my predecessors, Bill Donaldson, created an Office of Risk Assessment and staffed it up. Over the years since, it has dwindled rather significantly. And the idea is that, regulators would love to see around the corner. We would love to be able to predict the next problem so we can prevent it. I mean, that's frankly what we're there for and what we live for. It's been an elusive goal for everyone. But the fact is that if we could build up our risk assessment capability, and it's something I very much intend to do, and we could integrate risk assessment, not just in an office that stands alone, but into everything we do, so that whether you're worrying about money market fund rules, or you're worrying about corporate disclosure, or you're worrying about the capital standing of a broker-dealer, you are thinking about the related issues and the related risks. I think we will be more effective at understanding the problems at an earlier stage and hopefully being able to handle them. So incorporating risk assessment much more fundamentally in how the SEC approaches its job is important for that reason. And then it's important that we find a way to break down some of the barriers that have grown up between the regulators, whether because of competition, because of jealousy, because of a lack of trust. We are all on the same side of the table, and we have to start to act that way when it comes to sharing information and sharing risks, not competing for regulated entities, and being able to work together in a much more cohesive way than I think we've seen over the past 8 years. The last thing I'd say about this is that, and this is not by means of an excuse, but it is by means of helping people to understand, the SEC is responsible for about 35,000 regulated entities, 12,000 public companies, and then another 20,000 plus regulatees. We have a staff of 3,600 people. We are never going to see all the risks, and we are never even, if we can see them all, we're never going to be able to manage them all. And so the partnership with other regulators in this context becomes even more that critical because of our limited ability to reach everything that's going on out there. So I think we as an agency have a lot of work to do. I think we as a college or community of regulators have a lot of work to do to connect the dots more effectively than we have historically.